To the casual observer walking through the glass and steel canyons of Canary Wharf, the United Kingdom appears as an indomitable financial fortress, a global hub where trillions of dollars flow through fiber optic nerves every single day. But move just a few miles in any direction, and the veneer begins to crack, revealing a nation that is essentially a poor country with a very wealthy city attached to its side. We are currently witnessing the terminal phase of an economic model that has spent 40 years eating its own seed corn, trading long-term industrial capacity for short-term financial speculation. The signs are no longer subtle. The trains don't run, the hospitals are buckling under the weight of a demographic collapse, and for the first time in modern history, the British people are facing a sustained decline in their standard of living that feels less like a recession and more like a permanent state of being. This isn't just a string of bad luck or the temporary fallout from pandemic. It is the structural inevitability of a system that has reached its mathematical limit. In this investigation, we are going to perform a full autopsy on the sick man of Europe to understand how the world's first industrial superpower became a cautionary tale of managed decline. We will look past the political slogans to reveal the 7 specific mechanisms that are currently dismantling the British economy from the inside out. If you find this kind of deep systemic analysis valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. Your support allows us to maintain this level of independent, data-driven research into the forces shaping our world. Stay with us until the end of this video, because we will reveal a specific data point regarding the UK's net investment that explains why, under current conditions, a recovery isn't just difficult. It is physically impossible without a total reimagining of the British state. We are not looking at a rough patch in the road. We are looking at the end of the road for the post-imperial British model. This is the autopsy of an empire that forgot how to build. To understand why the United Kingdom is failing today, one must first understand the imperial ghost that haunts its balance sheet. For centuries, the British economy was structured to extract value from a global empire and process it through a dominant industrial heartland. When the empire dissolved, the administrative costs and the global pretensions of the state did not shrink to match its new reality. Instead, the UK attempted to maintain a world-class military, a massive welfare state, and a global financial center, while its domestic productive capacity was systematically hollowed out. This created a structural deficit, not just in money, but in purpose. The nation transitioned into a service economy, a term that sounds sophisticated but often masks a dangerous reality. A country that largely cuts each other's hair and sells each other insurance, while importing almost everything of physical value. The British system is now a high-maintenance Victorian mansion being funded by a gig economy paycheck. The math simply no longer works. The infrastructure that was built for a 19th century powerhouse is now a liability that the 21st century tax base cannot afford to repair, creating a doom loop where cutting costs leads to lower growth, which necessitates further cuts. The primary engine of any economy is productivity, the amount of value a worker creates for every hour they spend on the clock. In a healthy system, this number rises as technology improves and capital is invested in better tools. However, in the United Kingdom, this engine stalled in 2008 and has barely flickered since. This is the productivity puzzle, a phenomenon where British workers are essentially stuck in a time capsule. Today, a British worker produces roughly 20% less per hour than a worker in the United States, France, or Germany. If British productivity had simply continued on its pre-2008 trend, the average worker would be significantly wealthier, and the government would have billions more in tax revenue to fix the crumbling National Health Service. The reason for this stagnation is not that British workers are lazy, but that they are chronically under-equipped. When we look at the data for business investment, the UK consistently sits at the bottom of the G7 league table. Instead of investing in automation, advanced software, or modern machinery, British firms have spent the last 15 years relying on a pool of relatively low-priced labor. Why buy $1 million robotic car wash when you can hire 5 people at minimum wage to do it with buckets? This reliance on cheap hands instead of smart machines has trapped the UK in a low-wage, low-skill equilibrium. Furthermore, The management culture in the UK has historically prioritized short-term dividends and shareholder payouts over long-term capital expenditure. The infrastructure supporting these workers is equally atrophied, from slow internet speeds in regional hubs to a rail network that is both expensive and unreliable. The physical environment of the UK acts as a friction on every transaction. When a technician spends 2 hours stuck in traffic or waiting for a canceled train, that is 2 hours of zero productivity added to the national ledger. This lack of investment creates a compounding effect. Because companies don't invest, wages stay flat. Because wages stay flat, consumer spending is weak. Because consumer spending is weak, companies see no reason to invest in expansion. This is the definition of a stagnant system. The puzzle isn't actually a mystery when you look at the raw numbers of capital formation. It is the logical outcome of a nation that stopped valuing the workshop and started focusing exclusively on the shop floor. The UK is effectively trying to run a modern economy on the digital equivalent of dial-up internet and steam-age logic. If productivity is the engine of an economy, then the housing market is the ground upon which that engine must sit. In the United Kingdom, that ground is effectively a vertical cliff. To understand the British economic paralysis, one must look at the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, a piece of post-war legislation that fundamentally changed the nature of land use. By requiring explicit planning permission for almost any form of development, the state inadvertently created a system of artificial scarcity that has transformed the British home from a place of residence into the nation's primary vehicle for wealth extraction. This is not a functioning market. It is a pyramid scheme where the productive energy of the young is harvested to subsidize the asset portfolios of the old. The mechanics of this system are governed by NIMBYism, not in my backyard, a powerful political force where existing homeowners have every incentive to block new developments to protect their property values. This creates a supply and demand imbalance so severe that housing costs in major economic hubs like London or Cambridge consume over half of the average worker's take-home pay. When a nation spends its capital on bidding up the price of existing Victorian terraces rather than investing in new technology or businesses, the entire economy begins to cannibalize itself. The capital that should be flowing into the next big thing is instead locked in the walls of overpriced semi-detached houses, where it does nothing to improve national productivity. Furthermore, this housing crisis acts as a direct tax on geographic mobility. In a healthy economy, workers move to where the jobs are most productive. In the UK, a software engineer in the north might want to move to a high-productivity cluster in the south, but the cost of living differential often makes the move a net loss. This spatial misallocation means that the UK's most productive cities are effectively closed to the people who would make them even more successful. The planning system has turned the UK into a series of disconnected economic islands, where the cost of entry is a mortgage that requires 2 high-income salaries just to reach the baseline of middle-class stability. As the bubble expands, the systemic risk grows. The UK economy is now so dependent on high house prices to sustain consumer confidence and bank balance sheets that a significant correction would likely trigger a systemic collapse. This has forced the government into a permanent state of propping up the market with various subsidies, which only serves to push prices even higher. It is a closed loop of inefficiency that rewards land ownership over innovation, ensuring that the UK remains a nation of landlords and tenants rather than engineers and entrepreneurs. This is the structural reality that ensures the British middle class remains perpetually on the brink of insolvency. Following the 2008 financial crisis, the United Kingdom embarked on a fiscal experiment that would define its current state of decay: austerity. The logic presented to the public was simple. The nation had to live within its means. However, in the context of a sovereign state with its own currency, this household-style accounting led to a catastrophic doom loop. By aggressively cutting public investment to reduce the deficit, the government inadvertently choked off the very growth required to pay down the debt. This wasn't just a reduction in spending. It was the systematic dismantling of the state's foundational infrastructure, from social care to judicial services and local government. The mathematical failure of austerity lies in the fiscal multiplier. When a government cuts investment during a period of low private demand, the resulting decline in GDP is often greater than the initial savings. For the UK, this meant that while the deficit was eventually reduced, the debt-to-GDP ratio actually increased because the denominator, the economy itself, was stagnant. We see the physical manifestation of this logic in the current state of British public services. Schools are literally crumbling because of reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete that was never replaced, and the National Health Service is operating at a permanent crisis level because the capital investment in beds, scanners, and modern IT systems was frozen for a decade. The systemic implication of this underinvestment is a clogged society. When a justice system has a backlog of tens of thousands of cases, business contracts cannot be enforced efficiently. When the health service fails to treat people quickly, the number of workers leaving the labor force due to long-term sickness reaches record highs, currently exceeding 2.8 million people. This is the ultimate irony of austerity. By trying to save money on the balance sheet, the UK has created a massive, unquantified liability in its human and physical capital. The state is now spending more on the consequences of failure, such as emergency healthcare and crisis management, than it would have spent on the investment required to prevent that failure. This doom loop is reinforced by a political architecture that prioritizes short-term fiscal targets over long-term strategic planning. Every time a budget is drafted, the incentive is to cut capital spend, things like new railways or laboratories, because those cuts don't hurt the voter immediately. But over a decade, these missing investments compound. The UK has essentially been a company that stopped repairing its factory floor to make its quarterly dividends look better. Eventually, the machines stop working altogether. We are now at the point where the cost to simply return the UK's infrastructure to a baseline level is so high that no political party can realistically fund it without a total overhaul of the tax system. While housing and austerity have hollowed out the domestic economy, the UK's energy strategy has left it uniquely exposed to the whims of global markets. For a nation that sits on significant natural resources and led the world in the first industrial revolution, the current state of British energy is a testament to strategic drift. The UK has one of the least energy-efficient housing stocks in Western Europe, the leaky homes of Britain, which means that for every unit of energy imported, a significant portion is literally wasted through uninsulated walls. This creates a baseline level of cost of living pressure that is structurally higher than its continental neighbors. The energy trap was sprung with the closure of domestic gas storage facilities and a delayed decision-making process on nuclear power. By the time the global energy shock of 2022 arrived, the UK was reliant on just-in-time deliveries of liquefied natural gas, LNG, and electricity interconnectors from Europe. This lack of strategic redundancy meant that British businesses and households face some of the highest electricity prices in the industrialized world. For a deindustrializing nation, high energy costs are the final nail in the coffin of manufacturing. It is mathematically impossible to run an energy-intensive factory in the UK when the input costs are 30% to 50% higher than in the United States or China. This dependency has a profound impact on the UK's balance of payments. Because the UK must import such a vast quantity of its energy and food, it is essentially a price taker on the global stage. When the value of the pound sterling drops, the cost of heating a home in Manchester or powering a bakery in Birmingham rises instantly. This creates a permanent inflationary bias in the British economy that the Bank of England is forced to combat with higher interest rates, which in turn crushes the housing market and stifles business investment. It is a system of interconnected failures where a weakness in energy security propagates through every other sector. The transition to green energy, while necessary, presents its own set of structural hurdles. The UK's national grid is currently a bottleneck. New wind farms and solar arrays often have to wait over a decade to be connected to the system due to a lack of physical cable capacity and planning delays. This is the infrastructure paralysis we discussed earlier, applied to the most critical resource of the 21st century. The UK is effectively a country with the potential to be the Saudi Arabia of wind, but with the grid capacity of a much smaller, less ambitious nation. Until the physical reality of cables and turbines catches up with the political rhetoric of net zero, the UK will remain trapped in an energy cost cycle that drains the wealth of its citizens and the competitiveness of its industries. In the world of international trade, there is a fundamental principle known as the gravity model. The idea that economic interaction is directly proportional to the size of the economies and inversely proportional to the distance between them. By leaving the European single market, the United Kingdom performed an unprecedented experiment in economic physics. It intentionally introduced friction into its most significant trade relationship. While the political debate focused on sovereignty and borders, the economic reality was the creation of a massive, invisible wall of bureaucracy. For a service-oriented economy that relied on the just-in-time integration of European supply chains, this friction was not merely an inconvenience. It was a systemic shock that permanently lowered the UK's growth trajectory. The mechanics of this failure are found in the rules of origin and the myriad of sanitary and phytosanitary checks that now govern British exports. For small and medium-sized enterprises, the cost of compliance has often exceeded the profit margin of the trade itself, leading to thousands of firms simply ceasing to export to the continent altogether. This is the hollowing out of the trade base. Furthermore, Brexit triggered a sustained investment strike. Since the 2016 referendum, business investment in the UK has essentially plateaued, trailing significantly behind its G7 peers. Capital is cowardly. It seeks stability and predictable market access. By detaching itself from the European regulatory orbit without a clear, high-growth alternative, the UK signaled to global investors that it was a market with higher risks and lower rewards. This friction is not a one-time cost, but a permanent tax on British productivity. Every hour a truck spends idling at a port, every form filled out by a customs agent, and every laboratory that loses access to European research funding represents a drain on the nation's potential. The promised Brexit dividend has been mathematically eclipsed by the loss of tax revenue resulting from a smaller economy. The UK is now caught in a mid-Atlantic trap, too small to compete with the sheer industrial scale of the United States or China, yet no longer part of the European trade bloc that provided it with collective bargaining power. This loss of scale has reduced the UK's ability to negotiate favorable trade deals elsewhere, as most nations prioritize the massive markets of the EU or the US over a medium-sized island in the North Atlantic. The systemic result is a currency that is more sensitive to global shocks and an economy that is less resilient to inflationary pressures. Because the UK imports a vast majority of its finished goods and food from the EU, the added cost of border friction is passed directly to the British consumer. This contributes to the cost of living crisis in a way that is structurally different from the inflation seen in other nations. It is a sovereignty tax that the British public pays every time they purchase imported goods. The UK has essentially traded economic efficiency for political autonomy, only to find that in a globalized world, true autonomy is impossible without the economic engine to back it up. The United Kingdom is facing a silent mathematical catastrophe in the form of its demographic architecture. Like much of the developed world, the UK has an aging population, but its specific policy response, the pension triple lock, has created a generational wealth transfer that is effectively cannibalizing the future to pay for the past. The triple lock ensures that the state pension increases every year by whichever is highest: inflation, average wage growth, or a flat 2.5%. While this was designed to protect the dignity of the elderly, in a stagnant economy where wages are not growing, it has become a mechanism that forces the young and productive to subsidize a standard of living for the retired that they themselves will likely never enjoy. The dependency ratio, the number of retirees compared to the number of working-age adults, is tilting toward a breaking point. As the baby boomer generation enters retirement, the cost of the state pension and the associated healthcare requirements of the National Health Service are skyrocketing. Currently, the UK spends over £120 billion annually on state pensions, a figure that is projected to grow significantly. Because this spending is ring-fenced by political necessity, it leaves less and less room in the budget for the very things that drive long-term growth: education, infrastructure, and research. The UK is becoming a pension fund with a small, struggling economy attached to it. This demographic siege is compounded by the housing crisis we discussed earlier. The young, who are already burdened by high rents and stagnant wages, are also the primary tax base for this expanding elderly population. This creates a double squeeze. A worker in their 20s or 30s is paying a record percentage of their income into a system that provides them with deteriorating public services and no realistic hope of homeownership. This is driving a brain drain, where the UK's most highly educated and mobile citizens, doctors, engineers, and tech workers, are increasingly looking to emigrate to nations with better value for tax propositions, such as Australia, Canada, or the United States. When the most productive members of a society begin to leave, the system enters a terminal decline. The tax burden falls on an even smaller group of people, necessitating further tax hikes or service cuts, which in turn accelerates the exodus. The political reality is that the elderly are the most reliable voting bloc, meaning that no government has the courage to reform the triple lock or the planning laws that protect older homeowners' assets. The UK is effectively trapped in a gerontocratic stagnation, where the short-term political needs of the retired are prioritized over the survival of the national economy. This is not just a policy choice. It is a structural defect that ensures the UK remains a low-investment, low-growth society for the foreseeable future. When we synthesize these factors, the productivity puzzle, the housing pyramid, the austerity loop, energy dependency, Brexit friction, and the demographic siege, we see that the United Kingdom is not suffering from a series of isolated problems. Instead, it is caught in a complex system failure. Each of these mechanisms reinforces the others, creating a negative feedback loop that makes recovery nearly impossible within the current framework. For example, the housing crisis prevents labor mobility, which worsens the productivity puzzle. Stagnant productivity leads to lower tax revenues, which necessitates more austerity, which further degrades the infrastructure needed to solve the energy and trade crises. The UK has transitioned from a nation that produces and exports to a nation that consumes and debts. Its current account deficit, the gap between what it spends abroad and what it earns, is a testament to this dependency. For decades, this gap was filled by selling off British assets, infrastructure, utilities, and real estate. But you can only sell the family silver once. Today, the UK is increasingly reliant on the kindness of strangers, international investors who must be convinced to keep buying British debt. In a world where interest rates are no longer zero, this reliance makes the UK uniquely vulnerable to market sentiment, as seen during the brief but catastrophic mini-budget crisis of 2022. This is the terminal architecture of a post-imperial state. The UK is attempting to maintain a global military footprint, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and a world-class financial center using an economic engine that has been systematically under-maintained for 40 years. The sick man of Europe label is returning not because of a temporary virus, but because of a chronic, structural wasting disease. The UK is essentially a service-led economy that has lost its comparative advantage, a trading nation that has built its own trade barriers, and a society that has decided to prioritize the preservation of existing wealth over the creation of new value. To break this cycle would require a radical, multi-decadal reconstruction of the British state, a total overhaul of the planning system, a massive increase in state-led capital investment, and a fundamental renegotiation of its relationship with its largest trading partners. However, the political architecture of the UK, designed for stability and incremental change, is ill-equipped for such a radical pivot. As a result, the most likely outcome is not a sudden collapse, but a managed decline. The UK will continue to feel poorer, not because it is losing money in absolute terms, but because it is failing to keep pace with a rapidly evolving world. It is the end of the imperial dream and the beginning of a new, humbler reality as a medium-sized island struggling to find its place in the 21st century. We promise you a specific data point that explains why a recovery under the current architecture is mathematically improbable. That number is the United Kingdom's net national investment. For the better part of the last 3 decades, the UK has consistently ranked at the very bottom of the G7 for total investment. In fact, if the UK had merely matched the average investment levels of its G7 peers since the year 1990, an additional £500 billion would have been injected into the British economy. Instead, the nation has essentially been living off its past capital, running down its roads, its hospitals, and its energy grids without replacing them at the rate they decay. This is the definition of a consumption-led decline. You cannot grow a modern economy if your net investment in the future is effectively zero after accounting for depreciation. It is the architectural equivalent of a homeowner selling the roof tiles to pay for the heating bill. Eventually, the rain comes in, and there is nothing left to sell. The sick man of Europe is not suffering from a temporary ailment, but from the terminal symptoms of a post-imperial identity crisis. The United Kingdom is no longer the workshop of the world, nor is it the world's banker in the way it once was. It is a nation that has specialized in the management of decline, prioritizing the protection of asset prices for a shrinking elite while the productive base of the country atrophies. The 7 structural failures we have analyzed, from the productivity puzzle to the demographic siege, are not bugs in the system. They are the system. They are the logical outcome of 40 years of prioritizing short-term financial returns over long-term structural health. This is the end of the line for the model that sought to run a global power on a service sector budget. The empire hasn't just ended in a political sense. It has ended on the balance sheet. As we have seen, the path forward requires more than just a change in leadership. It requires a total reimagining of what the British state is for. Until the country decides to value building over rent-seeking and investment over consumption, the stagnation will continue. This has been an autopsy of a system that forgot how to innovate, and we hope this deep dive has provided you with the structural clarity to see past the daily headlines. If you value this kind of investigation into the hidden mechanics of our global economy, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It is the best way to ensure we can keep bringing you these deep systemic analyses. Thank you for watching and for staying with us until the very end. Until the next video.